Bruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Tezvav Amud Aleph, about a third way from the bottom, 18 lines from the bottom. From the two dots, the Gemara on Daf Yudalet Amud Beis brought a brisa because the Gemara said that when it comes to Yadayim, Stam Yadayim, Askonios Hein. And the Gemara challenge is indeed the Talmidim Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel that enacted this takana, this gezerah of Stam Yodayim. And the Gemara brought a brisa proving that Lechara Shammai Hazokein and Hillel Hazokein were the ones who made the decree. And in that brisa, the Gemara then brings Rabbi Yosi ben Yoezer ish Tzreida v'Yosi ben Yochanan ish Yushalayim. These are the two zugoi, one of the zugois that are found in the first parak of Masechet Avos, an Av Beistin and a Nasi, named Yosi ben Yoezer ish Tzreida and Yosi ben Yochanan ish Yushalayim. Gazru tumal eretz ha'amim v'al kli zechuchis. They made a gezerah decree on the eretz ha'amim that since the nations were not careful with the dead bodies where the cemeteries were, and therefore a person might inadvertently touch or have some sort of contact with these dead bodies, whereby he would become tamei, and therefore they made an enactment, the gezerah, that the eretz ha'amim is tamei if a person walks on the eretz ha'amim. In addition to that, they also made that the klei zechuchis, which are not found in the Torah as being a material that becomes tamei, they enacted Truma on this too. So these things, if they come in contact with Truma, they'll poisel the Truma. Says the Gemara, V'ho Rabbanon d'shmoinim shana gazur. Behold, the Rabbanon, at a much later time, 80 years before the Churban Bayis Sheni, they were the ones who were goizer the Tumas of Eretz Ha'amim. The Omer of Kahano, Shecholo Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yosi, Sholchuloi. When Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yosi was ill, and when he fell ill, they sent him the following question or request: Rabbi, Emor lonu beis v'gimel dvorim shamarta mishum avicho. Tell us 2 or 3 things that you learned from your father. After all, his father was the great Rabbi Yosi ben Chalafta, who was the author of the Brisa Seder Olam. So tell us what he said. Tell us 2 or 3 things, historical events, facts that are going to be worthwhile for us to know. Sholach lohem, he sent back to them in response, Omar Abba, this is what my father said. Kuf pei shono ad sheloi chorav habayis, 180 years before the bayis was destroyed. Pashta malchus harisho al Yisrael, the Roman Empire began taking control over Klal Yisrael. Pei shana ad sheloi chorav habayis, 80 years before the Churban of Bayis Sheni, gazru tuma al eretz ha'amim. They were goizer tuma on eretz ha'amim. So we see that indeed this was done only 80 years before the Churban. Arboim shana ad sheloi chorav habayis golsa la Sanhedrin v'yashva la bechanuyos. 40 years before the Churban of Bayis Sheni, the Sanhedrin Gedolah, who normally sat in the Lishkas Hagozis, they exiled themselves to the area on the Har Bayis called Chaniyos. Now the Gemara asks a question in regard to this last statement that the Sanhedrin Gedolah moved from the Lishkas Hagozis to the Chaniyos. Lamai Hilchas, what significance does this have in terms of halacha? Rabbi Yitzchok bar Avdimi loymar shaloi donu dinei knosos. This comes to teach us that they did no longer adjudicate cases of knosos, of penalties. So long as they're there in the Lishkas Hagozis, they were able to then penalize people and make judgments on penalties. But once they went to Chaniyos, they no longer gave these knosos. Ask the Gemara, Dinei Knosos Salkadaitach, that would preempt them from giving Knosos, making adjudication on penalties on knossos just because they moved from the lishos hagozis? Ella, says the Gemara, Eima sheloidanu dina nefashos. You're right. Knossos they were able to continue to make, but when it comes to capital punishments, capital crimes, that they could not adjudicate where they were situated in the chanios, only when they were placed in the original place of lishos hagozis. Now the Gemara goes back to its original question. You said that indeed Rabbi Yossi ben Yoezer ish Shreda and Rabbi Yossi ben Yochanan ish Yerushalayim in the Brisa says that they were geyser on the Eretz Ha'amim, the Tumah, and yet we see over here from this statement that only 80 years before the Churban there was a gzeira on the Tumas of the Eretz Ha'amim. Says the Gemara, V'chitema b'pei shona nami inu havu. Maybe Yossi ben Yoezer ish Shreda and Yossi ben Yochanan ish Yerushalayim were all the way until the period of 80 years before the Churban. V'hatanya, behold, it says in the Brisa otherwise. Hillel v'Shimon Gamliel v'Shimon, Hillel Zaken and his son Shimon Gamliel and his son Shimon, Nahagu Nisiuson lifnei habayis mea shana. They were the Nisim 100 years before the Churban Bayis, beginning with Hillel HaZaken. V'ilu Yossi ben Yoezer ish Shreda, v'Yossi ben Yochanan havu kadime tuva. Whereas this zug of Yossi ben Yoezer ish Shreda and Yossi ben Yochanan ish Yerushalayim, they lived much before Hillel HaZaken, because Hillel HaZaken was a zug together with Shammai HaZaken, and they appear later than these two. This zug of Yossi ben Yoezer ish Shreda and Yossi ben Yochanan ish Yerushalayim. So it cannot be that they extended all the way until the time of the enactment, the later enactment. So we're left with a stira, with a contradiction between these two statements. Says the Gemara, Elo asu inhu gazur agusha lisroif va'avira v'loy klum. Rather, they initially, the two Yossis, they made a gezerah on the gush, on a mound of dirt, a clump of dirt from the Eretz Ha'amim, to saref, to burn, because of the suspected tumah. Va'avira, and if there was something that went in the avir, in the airspace of the Eretz Ha'amim, for example, it was in a box, or a person was traveling on a carriage, v'lo klum, that they didn't make a gezerah on. They weren't concerned about the ohel, if there was a grave underneath that permeated and went up, that they weren't concerned about. V'osu rabbanon de peishana, and the chachamim that came and enacted 80 years before the Churban, they were gozer avira litlois. They were added, and they said when it comes to those that came in only in the airspace of the Eretz Ha'amim, then they have the din of litlois. If it came in contact with truma, then it's true the truma doesn't have to be burned, but it also cannot be eaten. It has to be left until it becomes bad and not inedible. So therefore, that's what their new gzera was. Ask the Gemara, lememra dechada gezeraso hava l'sreifa. Do you mean to say that there was one gezera to burn it? That means already from the initial gezera of the two Yosis, when it comes to a gush, a clump of dirt, that who came in contact with truma, that truma has to be burnt. Ask the Gemara. It was stam yodayim that came in contact with truma, that was the first time that we had a gezerah that truma has to be burnt. Says the Gemara, Yadayim hu titchilas gezeirosen l'sreifa hamidi achrin eloi. We see from Ilfa's statement that was dafka, it was Yadayim that came in contact with truma that had to be burnt. That was the thing that had to be burnt only, but other things not. Says the Gemara to change. Elo asu inhu gozer agusha litlois va'avir v'loy klum. So you have to say that it was one lower stage. In other words, that the two Yosis, they made a gezerah when it came to the gush, a clump of dirt, so if that came in contact with truma, then the din is litlois. Again, not to have to be burnt, but also cannot be eaten, has to be left until it becomes inedible. Ve'avira v'lo klum, and then that on the avira, that nothing was nigzar. Ve'osu rabbon on the peishona, and the chachamim who came 80 years before the Churban, Gozer on Gusha Lisroif, Va'avira Litlois. They made a gzeira on the gush, on that clump that came in contact with truma, that truma has to be burnt. And on the avira, if the truma was only in the avira, let's say it was in the carriage, for example, traveling over the Eretz Ha'amim, then it has the din V'Litlois. Va'akati asked the Gemara, B'usha Gozur. Many years later, when the Sanhedrin, after the Churban, went to the city of Usha up north in the Galil, that's when it was enacted. As the Mishnah goes on to say, that there's several things that required that the truma, although it's in Suffolk, has to be burned. Disnan, alvav sveikos sarfen es truma. On 6 different doubtful types of things that are tamei, the truma that comes in contact with that must be burnt. Al sofek beis hapras. If the truma came in contact doubtfully in a beis hapras was a field that is suspected that there was a kever, and it was plowed, and therefore it's unknown whether there's pieces of that body, pieces of the bones that still remain in that field, whereby any contact in that field has the din, the halacha of being tamei. And therefore, if truma comes in contact with that, then it must be burnt. V'al sofek ofar haba me'eretz ha'amim. Oh, this is our inyan, where it says over here that if there's a sofek that the ofar came in contact with this truma, also has to be burnt. That truma has to be burnt. That's the gzeir of ofar that comes from eretz ha'amim. V'al sofek bigdei am ha'aretz. An am ha'aretz who's an ignoramus and is not careful with halacha, maybe his wife who's a nida sat on his garments and therefore would make them tamei. And therefore all of the garments of an am ha'aretz were the nigzar tuma. So therefore if truma came in contact with those garments of an am ha'aretz, it would also have to be burnt. V'al sofek kelim hanimtsoim. If there's doubtful status as to kelim that were in the Rishus Harabim, and it's not known whether somebody who was tamei for a zav or a zava to touch the kelim, since they are an av hatuma and they touch the kelim, they would make it tamei. So therefore, that also, if it came in contact with truma, would have to be burnt. The al safek harukin. If there's a doubt about spit, a person sees spit on the ground and it's not clear, maybe that came from a zav or a zava, and therefore that would then metame the truma that came in contact with it. That would also have to be burnt, misafek. The al safek may raglaim raglei odam. If there's a urine which is found on the ground, and it's a safek whether it came from a person, shekeneged may raglei behema, even if it's next to the urine of a animal, which is not going to have a problem, but since it could be still that there's this urine that is next to the urine of an animal, could potentially be urine from a person, and that person could have been a zav or a zava, somebody who was tamei. Therefore, if the truma came in contact with that, then misafek again, it has to be burnt. Al vadoi magon, the Brisa continues on vadai touching, val safek tumoson, sorfin as a truma. Whether on that which is certainly was known to be touched, but it's not clear, it's safek whether it has truma or not. That's what we're talking about, says the Tanakama, that you have to burn the truma, if the truma comes in contact with any of these things. Rabbi Yosi Oimer, it depends. Af al safek magon b'rishus hayochid sarfan. Even if you don't know whether he touched it or not, it's a safek whether he had physical contact with one of these things, but it's located in the rishus hayochid, then we are machmir and say, then it has to be burnt. V'chachami moimrim B'rishus hayachid toilin, b'rishus harabim taharin. It depends on where it is. B'rishus hayachid doesn't get the din of being machmir like it does in other places when it's midiraisa. And therefore over here, the din is only toilin, not sarfin. And if it's found in the b'rishus harabim, then it would be taharin. Ve'omar ula eilu vav sveikos be'usha hiskinu. And these vav sveikos were taught in Usha, which is a period of time much later than the Churban was. So therefore, how could it be that indeed the Gezerah was done earlier, either starting with Rabbi Yossi ben Yoezer Yisraelim ben Rabbi Yossi Yochanan ben Yishushalayim, and then subsequently with the 80 years before the Churban. Here it says that it happened even later, years later after the Churban in Usha, where the takana of the Gzeros of Tumos of the Ofar Habami Eretz Ha'amim was made. Answers the Gemara, Elo Asu Inhu Gazer Agusha Litlois Va'avira V'loi Klum. The initial Gezerah, which was done by the two Yosis, that was done, one, that it had a Gezerah on the Gush, which means on the clump of dirt from the Eretz Ha'amim, that if it came in contact with Truma, then the din is litlois, not to be burnt, but also cannot be eaten. It has to be left till it becomes unedible. Ve'avira v'lo klum. If it was in the air space of the Eretz Ha'amim, then it's not tamei whatsoever. The Truma can still be eaten. V'osu rabbanan d'shmonim shana. And then the Chachamim came 80 years before the Churban, and they were gazer idi v'idi litlois, not only when it comes to the gush of the ofar, but even when it comes to the airspace of the ofar. The din is if a truma comes in contact with one of those things, then it has to be toile. You have to then leave it. V'asi be'usha gazer agusha lisroif v'avira kidekoi koi. And in Usha, years after the Churban, they made an additional gzeira, and they said that the gush has to be burnt. When the truma comes in contact with that gush, that truma has to be burnt. And that truma that comes in contact with the airspace, then kedekoi koi.